Well, yesterday's lecture covered about 2,400 years, from the start of the first recorded Chinese dynasty, the Cheng, in 1500 BCE, to the end of the Tang Dynasty around 900 CE. We're slowing down today, but alas, not much. I've mentioned in 2 lectures now that the Tang Dynasty was officially Buddhist, and the Tang rulers supported Buddhist monasteries and served as patrons of much important Buddhist art. Another very important form of art that emerges around this period, actually a little before the Tang Dynasty, is the painted scroll. This non-required work is a hand scroll, which was horizontal and meant to be unrolled and studied. Hand scrolls were usually made of silk, although as paper technology improved, more would be made of paper and were read from right to left. Note that this work incorporates calligraphy. The Chinese considered calligraphy to be a higher art than painting, partly because the Chinese valued the written word so highly, and partly because it revealed the artist's status as a cultured and educated man. The Tang Dynasty fell in 907 CE, and for about half a century China splintered once again into smaller states. In 960, much of China was reunited under the Song Dynasty. Gradually, non-Chinese people from the north and west took over chunks of northern China, but the south remained under the control of the Song for about 150 more years. Despite the threat of invasion and continued military weakness, this was culturally a very vibrant time for the Chinese. Scroll painting remained an important art form, especially at the emperor's court, but the Song Dynasty also saw the emergence of landscape paintings as a dominant genre. These are also not required works, but Cheng was considered one of the great masters of this art form. The rise of landscape painting, as opposed to portrait painting, may have reflected social and intellectual changes that were taking place in China at this time. While landowning aristocrats were still a dominant force in China, the exam system was giving rise to something of a meritocracy. Occasionally, a very bright young man of less elevated birth would rise through sheer brilliance and hard work. Successful exam candidates and Confucian scholars came to be known as the literati, and they would remain a dominant force in Chinese society for several hundred years. Okay, I'm finally getting to a required work, but I felt it needed some context because part of what makes this work so important and Kuan so important are the ways he broke with Cheng and other landscape painters whose work he had earlier admired and apparently imitated. We don't know a lot about Kuan, but apparently he was an academy painter attached to the court who decided to leave the court and live in the countryside as a recluse. He was a follower of Taoism. And how does this show up in his work and in his personal life? This focus on living in nature and developing one's inner life is very Taoist, but Kuan is also associated with another very Chinese synthesis known as Neo-Confucianism. This slide is long and confusing, and the concepts themselves are deep and complicated. I'll be honest, even after a lot of reading and research, I'm not at all sure I get it myself, especially the difference between portraying nature directly and portraying nature's essential li and qi. I do not think I would have fared well on the Chinese civil service exam. But let's try to wrap our minds around it this way. I'm going to show you 2 required works from the 19th century, one from the US and one from Mexico. Both are landscapes. In fact, they're examples of romantic landscapes. Here's the US work, an example of what's called the Hudson River School. Stay tuned. And here's a Mexican painting, a little later, but representing pretty much the same art historical period. So what do these 2 works have in common with Kuan's landscape, which I'm assuming you have open in your workbooks? Well, they're both dramatic. They both include strong values, that is, contrasting shadings of light and dark, although, of course, Kuan's ink painting is monochromatic, and these are highly colored. All 3 works include tiny human figures, and each work portrayed as part of nature, but also fundamentally dwarfed by nature. The mule train on the bottom from Kuan's painting may be a group of pilgrims traveling to a Taoist or Buddhist monastery. They were often located in the mountains. But Kuan's painting plays with our perspective in a way that the other 2 paintings we just looked at do not. This painting is essentially divided into 3 registers, and each presents a somewhat different perspective. Note how each area of light and dark occupies different spaces. They don't really connect. In this painting, the top of the mountain is essentially unattainable. We see no path to the top. Van Kuan also employed distinctly different brushstrokes in each of the 3 sections. The foreground at eye level has what one art historian calls crisp, well-defined brushstrokes. The misty, large central area with the mountains is executed in a pale ink wash produced by diluting the ink with water. And what are called raindrop texture strokes capture the vertical cliffs. The artist also uses a different kind of brushstroke to portray different kinds of trees. So while the natural world is the subject, it is really not depicted naturalistically. The painting doesn't capture nature so much as it does, again, a philosophy of nature. Well, drum rolls. I finally got this painting right side up, Miss Jacobs. Any rate, here's another Back to the Future moment. By the time we get to our whopping 27 global contemporary works, we are all going to be gasping for breath. So I've been trying to introduce some of these works earlier. So why do you think I put these 2 works together? What do they seem to have in common? The artist of the work on the left is Korean, not Chinese, but inkwash or literati painting was very popular in Korea as well as China. As you'll hear soon, Korean art was heavily influenced by developments in China. This artist was quite deliberately using traditional Asian inkwash methods, even though the work also reflects the influence of 20th century abstract art. Stay tuned. Song Sunam was a leader of Korea's Sumukwa, or Oriental ink movement, in the 1980s. Sumukwa is the Korean pronunciation of the Chinese word for ink wash painting, also called literati painting. Think maybe the College Board might ask you to draw that connection? I would not bet against it. And there will be questions about summer trees on your unit test. Next dynasty, please. The Chinese name notwithstanding, the Yuan Dynasty was the first foreign dynasty to rule China, and it ruled until 1365. The first ruler of the Yuan Dynasty was Kublai Khan, grandson of the famed conqueror Genghis Khan and host to Marco Polo, whose descriptions of China under Kublai Khan excited a young fellow named Christopher Columbus. The Mongols don't have a very good rep, and for some good reasons, but Mongol rule actually brought important benefits to China. For our history, it was mostly good news, and this map tells you why. Any guesses? Basically, the Mongol Empire was divided up among Genghis Khan's grandsons, but they were sufficiently united to protect the very lucrative traffic on the Silk Road. With trade routes secure, economic and cultural exchange flourished in this period, even if many of the literati had lost their jobs in government and withdrew to their country estates to pout. Some call it the Pax Mongolica. The David Vases are probably the best-known porcelain vases in the world because of the rare inscriptions around their necks. This allows them to be dated very precisely to 1351 CE. The David Vases were named after the famous British collector who bought them in the 1920s when the Chinese Empire had disintegrated and the palace eunuchs started selling off imperial art. We know from the inscription that they were originally altar vases, commissioned by a man named Zhang Wenjin and presented as an offering to a Taoist temple. The vases also tell in a microcosm the story of art in the Yuan Dynasty. We now think of blue and white porcelain as quintessentially Chinese, but this archetypal Chinese aesthetic actually comes from Iran, where it had long been popular. You remember that mihrab that originally stood in an Isfahan mosque? It's from about the same period. Chinese merchants were eager to sell to this rich market, and with Mongol armies guarding the Silk Road, they could get their goods to this market safely. Iranian mines also gave Chinese the cobalt they needed to put the blue into their porcelain. What the Chinese brought to this exchange was porcelain technology. The technology had long existed to produce fine porcelain from kaolin, or very fine white clay. But adding color decoration presented serious problems because few substances could withstand the high temperatures that were needed to fire the kaolin into very delicate, hard porcelain. In the Yuan period, Chinese ceramicists discovered that ground cobalt, which again they were now acquiring from Iran, could be mixed with water and painted on an unfired piece of porcelain. In the kiln, the blackish pigment turned a rich shade of blue as a glaze. This innovation began the famous tradition of blue and white ware, which for centuries would be created for markets in China, the Muslim world, and Europe. Copper oxide was also used successfully as a decorative agent in the same way, creating the class of porcelains known as underglaze red. The blue is an overglaze. The imperial kilns in Jiangxi province became the most renowned center for porcelain, not only in China, but in the entire world. I've mentioned that the David Vases were made for a Taoist temple, so the imagery is, not surprisingly, very Chinese. We see our old friends, the phoenix and the dragon. These items were not made for the imperial household, but the phoenix and dragon nevertheless traditionally represent the empress and the emperor, respectively. But what is their greater significance in terms of Taoism? The phoenix often represents the yin, or passive feminine energy, and the dragon often represents the yang, or masculine active energy. Keep in mind, I am not a Taoist. In my experience, women have plenty of active energy. I'm going to pause here so that I don't choke YouTube in my final, and I hope shorter, lecture on Chinese art. I will talk about the Forbidden City and the formidable Chairman Mao.